The unbreakable bond. The stars shined brightly above as Ethan Carter stepped off the landing ramp of his shuttle. He had traveled across the galaxy to the distant planet Velmara, a world covered in silver forests and glowing rivers. As a human diplomat, his mission was simple: build peaceful relations with the Velmaran people. But he had no idea that one single act would change his life forever. The air was warm, carrying the scent of strange flowers. Ethan adjusted the translator device on his wrist and walked toward the towering palace ahead. Velmarans were known for their advanced technology and strict traditions. He had studied their culture, but there were still many mysteries he didn't fully understand. Suddenly, a loud cry echoed through the trees. Ethan turned his head sharply. A figure was running toward him. A Velmaran woman dressed in royal robes, her golden eyes wide with fear. Behind her, 3 armored men chased her with glowing weapons drawn. Without thinking, Ethan jumped into action. He sprinted forward and blocked the woman from her attackers. "Stay behind me," he shouted. The armored men hesitated, surprised by his interference. One of them growled in the Velmaran language. The translator crackled, translating his words. "Human, you do not understand what you are doing. Step aside." Ethan clenched his fists. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew he couldn't just watch someone get hurt. "No," he said firmly. "You're outnumbering her. That's not a fair fight." The Velmaran woman behind him whispered something in her own language. Then, suddenly, she grabbed Ethan's wrist. A sharp, burning energy rushed through his body, sending a shock straight to his heart. His vision blurred for a moment, and a strange connection formed between them. The attackers stepped back in horror. One of them gasped, "It is done. The bond has been sealed." Ethan blinked. "What? What bond?" The woman turned to face him, her golden eyes filled with a mix of shock and disbelief. You just became my chosen one." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" She took a deep breath and whispered, "In my culture, love is forever. And now, you belong to me." Trapped in an alien tradition. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. This had to be some kind of mistake. How could a simple touch create a bond? "You must be joking," he said, taking a step back. But the woman held his wrist tighter. "It cannot be undone," she said firmly. "The bond is now part of you, part of me." The guards lowered their weapons and bowed. One of them spoke with a serious voice. "Princess Sayara, we will inform the High Council." Ethan's eyes widened. "Princess." He had just bonded himself to a member of the royal family. Sayara turned back to Ethan, her expression hard. "Come with me," she ordered. "You must face the council. They will explain everything." "I'm not going anywhere," Ethan protested. "I came here for peace talks, not whatever this is." Sayara narrowed her eyes. "You have no choice. The bond has linked us forever. If you try to run, it will cause you pain." Ethan did not like the sound of that. He hesitated, but his wrist tingled with warmth, as if something inside him recognized the bond was real. Against his better judgment, he followed her toward the palace. No way out. The Velmaran palace was vast, with tall crystal walls that shimmered under the twin moons. Inside, the High Council sat in a circle, their robes flowing like water. They studied Ethan with unreadable expressions. An elder Velmaran stepped forward. "Human, do you understand what you have done?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I saved her. That's all." The elder nodded. "And by saving her, you accepted the sacred bond of Velmara, a bond that cannot be broken. You and Princess Sayara are now eternally connected." Ethan swallowed hard. There has to be a way to undo it. Sayara's jaw tightened. "You insult my people by asking that." Ethan looked at her, "But I didn't agree to this." The elder raised a hand. "It does not matter. The bond is beyond words. It is written in the soul." Ethan rubbed his temples. This wasn't happening. It was a cultural misunderstanding, a mistake. But the warmth in his wrist told him otherwise. Something inside him had changed. He turned back to Ziyara. "And what if I refuse?" She looked at him, and for the first time, her expression softened. "Then you will suffer. The bond does not just tie us emotionally. It connects our very existence. If you fight it, it will hurt both of us." Ethan exhaled, feeling trapped. He had faced many difficult situations in his career, but this was something entirely different. The elder spoke again. "You must stay in Velmera and learn our ways. Only then will you understand the true power of the bond." Ziyara crossed her arms. "And I will not make it easy for you, human." Ethan sighed. He had no choice. His fate was now bound to an alien princess. But deep inside, a part of him wondered, was this really a curse or something more? No escape from love. The walls of the Velmeran palace glowed with a soft, eerie light. Ethan Carter sat stiffly in a grand chamber, his mind racing. The room was filled with Velmeran nobles, their silver robes flowing like liquid metal, their golden eyes locked on him. The weight of their stares made his skin crawl. Across from him, Princess Ziyara sat tall and poised, her face unreadable. The warmth on his wrist where she had grabbed him still lingered, a quiet reminder that something inside him had changed. Ethan wasn't ready to believe in ancient alien magic or destiny, but he couldn't deny the strange pull he felt toward her. He had always relied on logic, on reason. But this was something he couldn't explain. The elder Velmeran from earlier stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You are now bound to the princess. This is an eternal bond. There is no escape, human." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I never agreed to this." Ziyara's golden eyes flashed with annoyance. "You saved me. That was the agreement." "That's not how agreements work," Ethan shot back. "Where I come from, people have a choice in." "You did have a choice," she interrupted. "You chose to interfere. You chose to save me. In Velmeran culture, a bond is not about words. It is about action. And your action bound you to me." Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to keep his frustration in check. He turned to the elder. "There has to be a way to break this." Silence filled the chamber. The nobles exchanged looks, their expressions unreadable. Finally, the elder sighed. "There is no way," he said. "The bond is beyond laws or traditions. It is woven into the soul." Ethan's hands tightened into fists. "And what if I refuse to accept it?" The elder's gaze darkened. "Then the bond will turn against you. The more you resist, the more pain you will feel. It will weaken you. It will torment you. And if the rejection becomes too great..." Ethan leaned forward. "If I reject it too much, what?" The elder hesitated before saying, "It could kill you. A bond that cannot be denied." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. His mind searched for a way out, a loophole, anything, but the expressions around him told him there was none. "So that's it?" he asked bitterly. "I'm just supposed to accept this?" Ziyara studied him, her sharp gaze showing no sympathy. "You are supposed to learn." The elder nodded. "You will stay here, human. You will live as a Velmeran. You will understand our ways. Only then will you see the bond for what it truly is." Ethan gritted his teeth. "And if I refuse?" The elder's voice was calm but heavy with meaning. "Then you will suffer." A sudden wave of heat washed over Ethan's body. It started from his wrist and spread up his arm, then his chest. It wasn't painful, but it was unnatural, as if something inside him was waking up. Ziyara stood, her voice firm. "The bond is already working. The more you deny it, the worse it will get." Ethan exhaled sharply. This wasn't happening. He had come here for diplomacy, not to be forced into an alien soul connection. "I need to think," he muttered, pushing to his feet. "You may go," the elder said. "But you cannot leave Velmera. Your fate is now tied to our world." Ethan turned and strode out of the chamber, his mind racing. Escape is not an option. Ethan moved quickly through the palace halls, ignoring the curious stares of the Velmarans. He needed a plan. There had to be a way out of this. He found his way to a large balcony overlooking the glowing forests below. The twin moons of Velmera hung high in the sky. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Running won't help you. Ethan turned sharply. Ziara stood behind him, her arms crossed. He scowled. I wasn't running. Her golden eyes narrowed slightly. That's what every human says before they try. Ethan exhaled. Look, I don't want to offend your culture, but this bond, it's not fair to me. Ziara stepped closer. Fair. She let out a small bitter laugh. Did you think fairness had anything to do with fate? Ethan looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time, he noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled slightly, as if she was just as trapped as he was. You didn't choose this either, he realized. Her gaze flickered, but she didn't answer. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. Then why do you act like I should just accept it? Because, she said, her voice quiet but firm, fighting it will only bring pain to both of us. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind carried the distant sound of singing creatures, the air thick with something unspoken. Ziara tilted her head slightly. Can you feel it yet? Ethan hesitated. Feel what? The bond. He opened his mouth to say no, but then he stopped. Because the truth was, he did feel something. A whisper at the edge of his mind, a strange awareness that hadn't been there before. He could sense her emotions. Not clearly, not like words, but like a presence. And that terrified him. Ethan took a step back. I need time. Ziara studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then take it. She turned and left without another word. Ethan stood there, staring at the Velmaran sky, his mind spinning. He didn't believe in fate. He didn't believe in destiny. But something deep inside him whispered that he was wrong. And that was the most terrifying thought of all. The hidden truth of the bond. Ethan Carter paced in his chamber, his mind racing. The Velmaran palace was beautiful, with its floating crystal lights and walls that shimmered like liquid silver, but to him, it felt like a gilded prison. He had spent hours searching for a way out, a loophole, an escape, anything. But every answer led back to the same impossible truth. He was bonded to Ziara. Forever. Ethan rubbed his wrist, the spot where she had grabbed him during the fight. The warmth was still there, an ever-present reminder of the connection. At first, he had dismissed it as a trick of the mind, but now he wasn't so sure. Because no matter how much he tried to ignore it, he could feel something. A presence, a whisper of emotions that were not his own. And worse, he was starting to recognize them. Right now, that presence was irritated, annoyed, impatient. The door to his chamber swung open without warning, and Princess Ziara strode in, her golden eyes flashing with frustration. You're avoiding me. Ethan sighed. What gave it away? She stepped closer, her arms crossed over her chest. This is not something you can run from, human. I'm not running. He gestured around the room. Pretty sure I'm trapped here. Ziara narrowed her eyes. You act as if this is a punishment. He laughed dryly. You don't think it is. She tilted her head, studying him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she sighed and sat down on the edge of the couch, her rigid posture relaxing slightly. I don't expect you to understand our ways, she admitted, but you could at least try. Ethan folded his arms. Why should I? Ziara looked at him, and for the first time, there was something in her gaze that wasn't anger. It was something softer. Because, she said quietly, you're not the first human this has happened to. The forgotten history. Ethan's breath caught. What? Ziara held his gaze. You heard me. That doesn't make sense, Ethan said, shaking his head. Humans and Velmarans don't have this kind of history together. If they did, the Galactic Council would know. Ziara's lips pressed into a thin line. The council knows only what is allowed to be known. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Ziyara hesitated, then stood. Come with me. He hesitated. Why should I trust you? She smirked. Because, bonded or not, you want answers. And I have them. Ethan exhaled slowly, then nodded. Fine. Lead the way. The secret archives. Ziyara led him through a series of hidden corridors, past guards who bowed but said nothing. They moved deeper into the palace, down a winding staircase that seemed older than the rest of the structure. The air grew cooler, the lights dimmer. Finally, they reached a sealed door covered in ancient markings. Ziyara placed her hand on the center, and the door hummed, sliding open with a soft chime. Ethan followed her inside, his eyes widening. The room was filled with floating archives, glowing symbols, and texts hovering in the air. Ziyara moved to the center, pressing a control panel. The symbols shifted, rearranging themselves into holographic figures. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. They were humans. Velmarans and humans, together, standing side by side, working together, some even bonded. This, Ethan breathed. This is impossible. Ziyara turned to him. It's the truth. Ethan stepped closer, scanning the figures. These weren't modern humans. Their uniforms were different, their weapons outdated. But there was no doubt. This was real. How long ago was this? He asked. Ziyara hesitated. Thousands of years. Ethan frowned. That doesn't make sense. Humans weren't advanced enough for space travel back then. Ziyara studied him. That's what you've been told. Ethan's mind raced. Could it be possible? Could humanity's past be far older than they knew? And if so, what happened to the humans who bonded with Velmarans before him? The consequence of rejection. As if reading his thoughts, Ziyara turned back to the archive and pressed another symbol. The glowing figures shifted, showing a man, a human, his face twisted in agony. Ethan stiffened. What happened to him? Ziyara's voice was quiet. He fought the bond. The hologram continued, showing the man growing weaker, his body trembling, his mind fracturing. Then, at the final moment, he collapsed, lifeless. Ethan felt a cold chill run down his spine. It destroyed him, he whispered. Ziyara nodded. The bond is not just tradition, Ethan. It's real. It exists in the mind, in the soul. If you fight it too much, it will turn against you. Ethan swallowed hard. And if I accept it? She met his gaze. Then it will make you stronger than you've ever been. Ethan's thoughts spiraled. Everything in him screamed to fight this, to deny it. But the evidence was right in front of him. His wrist tingled, the warmth now spreading to his chest. And deep inside, he could feel it. A part of him already knew she was right. Ethan turned to Ziyara. If I accept it, what happens next? Her lips curled into the smallest smile. Then, human, you will finally understand what it means to be chosen. Ethan took a slow, shaky breath. This wasn't just a cultural misunderstanding. This was something bigger. And whether he wanted to or not, he was now part of it. The enemies within. Ethan Carter couldn't sleep. He lay in his chamber, staring at the ceiling, his mind a battlefield of thoughts. Everything he knew about the universe had been shattered. Humans and Velmarans had a shared history, one that had been erased. The bond between him and Princess Ziyara wasn't just tradition. It was real, something deep in the mind, in the soul. And worst of all, rejecting it could kill him. His wrist tingled, the warmth from the bond a constant presence. But there was something else now. A faint sensation, like an invisible thread connecting him to Ziyara. It wasn't intrusive, but it was there. A quiet pulse, a whisper of her emotions at the edge of his mind. She's awake too. The realization hit him like a stone. He wasn't sure how he knew, but he could feel it. Ziyara was restless, just as he was. Ethan sighed and sat up. He needed air. A silent threat. The palace was quiet at night. The glowing crystal lanterns cast soft silver light across the halls. Ethan walked slowly, his mind still tangled in questions. Then, a sound. A whisper of movement. Ethan froze. Someone was there, watching. He turned his head slightly, pretending not to notice. His military training kicked in. His muscles tensed. Then, a shadow moved. Ethan spun just in time to dodge a blade aimed at his throat. The assassin wore dark Velmoran armor, their face hidden behind a mask. Ethan reacted on instinct. He grabbed the attacker's wrist and twisted, forcing the knife away. The assassin struck with inhuman speed, but Ethan was faster than they expected. A second attacker emerged from the shadows. Ethan barely dodged the strike. There's two of them, maybe more. He was unarmed, but he had fought worse odds before. He just needed an opening. Then, suddenly, pain. A sharp burning sensation exploded in his chest. He staggered, his breath catching. The bond. Something was wrong. Then he heard it, Zayara's scream. She was in danger. And before he could even think, his body moved on its own. The bond awakens. Ethan didn't remember how he got there. 1 second, he was fighting the assassins. The next, he was at Zayara's door, slamming it open. The scene before him made his blood turn to ice. Zayara stood in the center of her chamber, her golden eyes blazing with fury. 3 assassins surrounded her, their weapons drawn. One lunged. Zayara dodged, moving with elegant precision, but there were too many. Before he could stop himself, Ethan charged forward. The bond exploded to life inside him. His movements felt sharper, faster, stronger. He grabbed the nearest assassin and threw them across the room. Another turned to strike him, but Ethan dodged and drove his fist into their ribs. A shock of energy pulsed through his arm. The assassin flew backward, hitting the wall with a sickening crack. Ethan gasped. What was that? He didn't have time to think. The last assassin turned, realizing too late that the tide had shifted. Zayara moved like a bladed storm, striking with precision and grace. In seconds, the fight was over. Silence fell. Ethan stood there, breathing hard. His heart pounded. His wrist burned hot, but the pain was fading. Zayara wiped blood from her lip, turning to him. Her gaze locked onto his. You felt it, didn't you? Ethan swallowed. He didn't need to ask what she meant. The bond. It had reacted, guided him, empowered him. For a few seconds, he wasn't just Ethan Carter, human diplomat. He had been something more. The enemy in the shadows. Guards rushed in, responding to the attack. The assassins were dead or unconscious. The palace was on high alert. Ethan stood near the balcony, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Zayara joined him, her expression dark. They're not ordinary assassins, she said. They belong to the Valkyrie faction. Ethan frowned. Never heard of them. They believe Velmorans should be pure, untouched by outside influence. They want to destroy the bond tradition. Ethan exhaled sharply. And now they want to kill me. Zayara nodded. Because if a human successfully bonds with a Velmoran, it proves them wrong. Ethan clenched his fists. They would rather kill you than let this bond exist. Zayara didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out at the city below. Her voice was quieter when she spoke again. They would rather kill us both. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about him. This wasn't just about some forced tradition. This was a war waiting to happen, and he was right in the middle of it. A dangerous path forward. Ethan sat in his chamber once again, but this time, he wasn't looking for an escape. He was thinking about the bond, the Valkyrie, and the choice ahead of him. He had spent every moment since arriving on Velmera trying to reject this connection. But now he realized something terrifying. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted to protect himself and Zayara, he had to stop fighting it. He had to embrace it. Ethan closed his eyes, focusing on the warmth in his wrist. He reached out, not with his hand, but with his mind. And for the first time, the bond answered him back. A whisper, a pulse, and then Zayara's voice in his head. "You're finally listening." Ethan's eyes snapped open. Everything was about to change. The test of love and loyalty. Ethan Carter stood in the center of a grand Velmaran chamber, surrounded by the glowing symbols of an ancient ritual. The walls pulsed with golden light, reacting to something deep inside him. Something he was only beginning to understand. Across from him, Princess Zayara watched him carefully, her golden eyes unreadable. She stood poised, elegant, but there was a tension in her stance that told Ethan she was just as uncertain as he was. A high council sat in a half-circle around them. The elders, their robes shimmering like liquid silver, observed with unreadable expressions. At the center of the chamber, a large stone altar stood between Ethan and Zayara. Its surface was smooth, marked with glowing blue symbols. This was the trial of the bond, a sacred test that had been performed for thousands of years. A test that Ethan never asked for. But he had no choice. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted to prove that this bond wasn't a mistake, he had to face it. The elder at the front of the council raised his hand. "The time has come," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The trial of the bond will determine whether your connection is true or false. If the bond is real, you will emerge stronger. If it is weak, the consequences will be severe." Ethan glanced at Zayara. She held his gaze, unwavering. "Are you ready, human?" the elder asked. Ethan wasn't, but he stepped forward anyway. "Let's get this over with." Step 1. Sharing the past. The elder gestured to the altar. "Place your hand upon the stone." Ethan hesitated, but then did as he was told. Zayara did the same. The moment their hands touched the surface, a shock of energy ran through Ethan's body. Suddenly, he wasn't in the chamber anymore. He was somewhere else. A memory. He stood in a vast Velmaran palace garden, under a sky of twin moons. But this wasn't the present. This was Zayara's past. He saw a younger version of Zayara, no older than 10, standing beside a tall Velmaran warrior. Her father, the former king. The man placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You are strong, my daughter," he said, "but strength is not enough. One day, you will have to choose between your duty and your heart." Young Zayara frowned. A Velmaran warrior never chooses their heart over their duty. Her father smiled sadly. "That is what I once believed, too." Suddenly, the memory shifted. The garden was gone. Ethan was somewhere else entirely, this time in a familiar place, a military base. A moment later, he realized what he was looking at. It was his own past. Step 2. The pain of the past. Ethan saw himself, younger, wearing his Earth military uniform. He stood in a dimly lit room, fists clenched, his expression hard. Across from him was a superior officer, his face cold and unreadable. "You can't save everyone, Carter," the officer said. Ethan's younger self glared at him. "I can try." The officer sighed. "That's your weakness." Ethan remembered this day. It was the day he had been given a choice, to follow orders or to risk everything to save innocent lives. He had chosen to save them, and because of that choice, he had nearly lost everything. The memory faded, and Ethan staggered backward, gasping. He was back in the chamber. His heart pounded in his chest. He turned to Zayara. "You saw that?" She nodded slowly. "And you saw mine." The elder stepped forward. "You have now walked through each other's past. You have seen what the other carries. Now you must decide. Can you accept each other, knowing these truths?" Ethan's chest tightened. Zayara had been raised to believe in duty over love. He had spent his life defying orders to follow his heart. They were complete opposites. And yet, Ethan felt the bond between them, stronger now than ever before. Zayara met his gaze. "Do you accept this bond, Ethan?" He didn't hesitate this time. Yes, the altar glowed brighter. The bond was now stronger than ever. But before anyone could speak, a sudden explosion shook the chamber. A group of armed figures burst through the entrance. Ethan recognized them instantly. The HFY faction. They had come to stop the bond, and they were ready to kill for it. Step 3. The battle for the bond. The High Council barely had time to react before the HFY warriors rushed forward, their weapons raised. Ethan grabbed Ziyara and pulled her behind cover as blaster fire filled the chamber. The council members scattered, some raising shields to block the attack. Ziyara drew a blade from her side. "We end this now." Ethan grabbed a fallen guard's weapon and nodded. Agreed. Together, they moved as one. The bond pulsed between them, guiding their movements. Ethan could sense Ziyara's intentions before she even acted. When she dodged, he followed. When she struck, he covered her flank. For the first time, they weren't just tied together by fate. They were fighting as one. One by one, the HFY warriors fell. Some tried to retreat, but Ziyara cut off their escape. The final enemy stood before Ethan, his weapon shaking. "You don't understand," the man gasped. "If the bond between you grows, it will change everything. It will change Velmera. It will change you." Ethan stepped forward, unflinching. Good. With a swift strike, the last HFY warrior fell. Silence settled over the chamber. The fight was over. But Ethan knew this was just the beginning. A new future. The High Council gathered again, this time not to test the bond, but to recognize it. The elder stepped forward. "It is clear now. This bond is not a mistake. It is not a weakness. It is a bridge between our worlds." Ziyara turned to Ethan. "You could have rejected this. Even now, you still have a choice." Ethan took a slow breath. Once, he would have done anything to break free. But now he understood. He looked into Ziyara's eyes and said the words that would change his life forever. "I choose this." The bond flared to life inside them, stronger than ever. And with that, their fates were sealed. The ultimate betrayal. The halls of the Velmeren Palace were eerily silent. Ethan Carter stood on a high balcony, looking over the silver forests that stretched beyond the city. The stars above were unfamiliar, the twin moons casting a soft glow over the landscape. He had never felt more tied to a place, and yet he had never felt more trapped. The bond between him and Princess Ziyara was stronger than ever. He could feel her presence, even when she wasn't near. Her emotions brushed against his mind like a whisper, a connection that was impossible to ignore. And now, it wasn't just a symbolic connection. It was real. He had accepted it. He had fought for it. And that had put a target on his back. The HFY faction wanted him dead. The High Council was divided. Some saw him as a threat, others as a symbol of change. Velmera was on the edge of something dangerous. And Ethan had a feeling that something even worse was coming. A sudden betrayal. The council chamber was filled with whispers. The High Council had gathered once again, and the tension in the room was thick as smoke. Ziyara stood at Ethan's side, her posture rigid. She knew something was wrong. Then, the doors swung open. A Velmeren warrior strode in, his silver armor gleaming under the light. His golden eyes locked onto Ziyara, and then onto Ethan. He stepped forward and bowed slightly. "Princess Ziyara, the council has made a decision." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Ziyara's voice was calm but sharp. "What decision?" The warrior's gaze hardened. "By order of the High Council, Ethan Carter is to be arrested immediately." A heavy silence fell over the chamber. Ethan stiffened. "What?" Ziyara took a step forward, fury flashing in her eyes. "On what grounds?" The warrior didn't hesitate. "Ethan Carter has disrupted the balance of Velmera. His presence is causing division among our people. The council believes he is a danger to our world." Ethan clenched his fists. "That's ridiculous. I fought for this bond. I proved myself. The warrior's expression didn't change. And that is precisely why they fear you. Guards stepped forward, weapons raised. Ziara's hand went to the hilt of her blade, but Ethan gently touched her arm. "Don't," he murmured. "Not yet." She turned to him, rage and conflict battling in her gaze, but she understood. If they fought now, it would only make things worse. For now, they had to play along. Ethan allowed himself to be taken, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. Imprisoned. The prison cell was cold, the metal walls smooth and silent. No windows, no way out. Ethan sat on the floor, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced. Who had done this? Who had turned the council against him? He had fought for this bond. He had proven himself, and yet he had still been betrayed. Then a presence entered his mind. Ziara. He felt her frustration, her anger. And beneath that, something else. Fear. A moment later, the door slid open. Ziara stood there, breathing hard, her golden eyes filled with determination. "You're not staying here," she said. Ethan pushed himself up. "What's happening?" She stepped closer. "Someone in the council is working with the Vicari." This wasn't just politics. This was planned. Ethan's jaw tightened. "So they don't just want me gone. They want me dead." She nodded. "We don't have much time. We need to get out of here." Ethan glanced at the guards lying unconscious outside the door. He smirked. "You work fast." Ziara didn't smile. "Faster than you think. Let's move." The escape. They moved through the palace corridors, staying in the shadows. Ziara led the way, her movements precise and silent. Ethan followed, his senses sharp. The bond made everything clearer. He could almost predict her steps, her choices. It was like they were one. But then, an ambush. Guards appeared from every direction, weapons drawn. Ziara cursed under her breath. They were waiting for us. Ethan exhaled sharply. Of course they were. Then, a familiar figure stepped forward. One of the council elders. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You." The elder's gaze was cold. "You should have left when you had the chance, human." Ziara's hand tightened around her blade. "You betrayed me." The elder's expression didn't change. "I did what was necessary. The bond is dangerous. It threatens everything we have built." Ethan stepped forward. "You're afraid of change." The elder's eyes darkened. "I am afraid of what this bond could become." The guards moved closer. Ethan and Ziara tensed, ready to fight. Then, without warning, Ziara lunged. The battle was fast and brutal. Blades clashed. Energy pulses filled the air. Ethan fought alongside her, their bond guiding their movements. The guards fell one by one, but more were coming. Ziara turned to Ethan, breathing hard. "We can't stay here." Ethan nodded. "Then we find another way." They turned and ran, disappearing into the depths of the city. A dangerous choice. Hours later, they sat in a hidden chamber beneath the palace, catching their breath. Ethan looked at Ziara. "What now?" She hesitated, then spoke the words he wasn't expecting. "We have to leave Velmera." Ethan stiffened. "What?" Ziara's expression was grim. "As long as we are here, they will hunt us. The only way to survive is to leave." Ethan exhaled. "You're the princess. You're supposed to lead your people." She looked at him, and for the first time, there was pain in her gaze. "I would rather fight for something real than rule over a lie." Ethan stared at her, then slowly nodded. They had no choice. They had to run. And somehow, he knew, this was only the beginning. Love that defies time. The Velmeran skyline stretched endlessly before them, the twin moons casting silver light over the towering crystal spires. From the shadows of a hidden passageway beneath the palace, Ethan Carter and Princess Ziara prepared to do something that had never been done before. Escape. Ziara's breathing was steady, but Ethan could feel her tension. The bond between them wasn't just a physical connection anymore. It had grown deeper, the living thing inside them both. He could sense her thoughts, her fears, her determination. Velmera had turned against them. The High Council, once Ziara's allies, had betrayed her. The Vikari faction, the extremists who saw their bond as a threat, wanted them dead. And now, they were about to leave everything behind. Ethan turned to Ziara. Once we step off this planet, there's no going back. She didn't hesitate. Then let's go. The Great Escape. The palace gates were heavily guarded. Velmaran warships hovered in the sky, scanning for them. Their faces were likely being broadcasted across the planet as traitors. But Ziara had planned ahead. She led Ethan through a maze of tunnels, past hidden corridors and secret pathways only known to the royal family. Finally, they emerged near an abandoned hangar, where a small stealth-class starship waited for them. Ethan whistled. "You've been planning this for a while." Ziara smirked. "I like to be prepared." They moved quickly, but just as they reached the ship, an alarm blared through the hangar. "They found us," Ziara muttered. Ethan cursed. How long to get this thing off the ground? Ziara sprinted toward the control panel. Less than a minute. They didn't have a minute. A squad of Velmaran warriors stormed into the hangar, their weapons charged and ready. Ethan grabbed a blaster from the ship's emergency supply and fired the first shot. The air erupted with energy bolts, the battle exploding around them. Ziara dodged an attack, her movements flawless and precise. She fought with a grace that Ethan had never seen before, like the bond itself was guiding her. But more guards were coming. Ziara shouted over the chaos. "Get inside. I'll cover you." Ethan hesitated for half a second. Then he listened. He sprinted into the ship, powering up the engines as Ziara took down the last warrior with a swift, brutal strike. She leaped into the cockpit just as the ship lifted off the ground. Ethan didn't wait. He punched the thrusters. The ship shot forward, blasting through the hangar doors. Behind them, alarms screamed. Velmaran warships turned, locking onto their signal. Ziara's voice was calm but urgent. "They're preparing to fire." Ethan grinned. "Not if I can help it." He flipped the controls, sending the ship into a wild spiral. Plasma bolts streaked past them, missing by inches. Ziara grabbed onto the side of the seat. "Are you sure you can fly this thing?" Ethan smirked, adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Nope." She muttered something in Velmaran, but then, suddenly, a massive explosion shook the sky behind them. Ethan's eyes widened as the Velmaran warships collided in midair, taken down by a shockwave of energy. He turned to Ziara. "Did you do that?" She shook her head. "No, that was the bond." Ethan felt his breath hitch. The bond had protected them. Somehow, in some way, it had acted on its own. And that meant it was evolving. A new beginning in the stars. The moment they broke through Velmera's atmosphere, the tension in Ethan's chest loosened. For the first time since he had arrived on this planet, he was free. But at what cost? He turned to Ziara. She was staring at the distant stars, her expression unreadable. She had just left her home behind, her people, her duty, everything. Ethan reached out, gently touching her hand. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer right away. Then, finally, she whispered, "I don't know." Silence settled between them. Ethan took a deep breath. "We have options. We can go anywhere. The outer colonies, deep space." Ziara shook her head. "They will never stop hunting us." Ethan knew she was right. A High Council wouldn't allow them to just disappear. The Vikari would see them as enemies forever. Their bond wasn't just a connection between two people anymore. It was a threat to an entire world. And that meant they had only one choice. "We fight," Ethan said. Ziara looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her golden eyes. He continued, his voice steady. "If they won't stop coming for us, we don't run. We make them understand. We prove to them that this bond isn't something to fear." Sayara studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. A real, genuine smile. "I never thought I'd hear a human say something so bold." Ethan smirked. "Guess I'm full of surprises." She exhaled, looking back at the stars. "Then it looks like we have a war to win." Ethan tightened his grip on the controls, setting a course toward the unknown. Together, they had defied fate. Together, they had broken the chains of tradition. And together, they were about to change the galaxy forever.